Wyoming Territory, 1882. Winter came early to Sweetwater County, laying a shroud of white across the rugged landscape. The biting December wind howled through the passes of the Wind River Range, carrying with it the promise of a harsh season ahead. In this unforgiving land, where nature showed no mercy and distance measured life's worth, Vaughn Forrester believed one thing with absolute certainty: a man survived the frontier alone or not at all. Vaughn adjusted his worn leather gloves as he surveyed the cattle herd from atop his chestnut quarter horse. At 26, he'd already seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes. The sun-bronzed planes of his face remained impassive, masking the turmoil beneath. Though young, his eyes carried the weathered look of someone who had learned frontier lessons the hard way. "We'll lose at least a dozen head before spring," he said to his ranch hand Lyle, who rode alongside him. "This cold set in too early." "That's if the bannock don't get to them first," Lyle replied, his breath visible in the frigid air. Vaughn nodded grimly. The bannock hadn't caused trouble for nearly 4 years, but tensions always simmered below the surface. His ranch, the Double Fork, sat on contested land, a fact that gnawed at him during sleepless nights. "I've seen what happens to men who bring women and children out here," Vaughn said, thinking of the abandoned homesteads that dotted the territory. "This land takes everything eventually." Lyle merely shrugged. At 62, he'd learned when not to argue with the young boss. Vaughn had built the Double Fork from nothing after his parents died in a flash flood 5 years earlier. He employed 4 hands, all older men with no family ties. He preferred it that way: no complications, no one depending on him, no hearts to break when the frontier inevitably claimed another soul. "Boss," Lyle said, interrupting his thoughts, "you got that letter from Cheyenne about supplying the new outpost, didn't you?" Vaughn nodded. The territorial governor had established a series of small outposts to improve mail delivery and security. The Double Fork had been contracted to supply beef and horses to the nearest one, a 3-day ride west. "I'll head out tomorrow," Vaughn said. "You mind the ranch." That night, as a storm rattled the windows of his modest but sturdy ranch house, Vaughn read the contract again by lamplight. The pay was good enough to get the Double Fork through winter without slaughtering too many breeding stock. But something about the hastily established outposts troubled him. They were too far apart, too poorly manned. Like everything else in the territory, they seemed designed to fail. "Just like those fool homesteaders," he muttered to himself, folding the paper, "coming out here with dreams bigger than their supplies." The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Vaughn loaded 4 pack horses with supplies and prepared for the journey. He traveled light but prepared rifle, pistol, heavy coat, and provisions. The territory forgave no mistakes. 2 days into his journey, the weather changed. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind carried the unmistakable smell of snow. Vaughn pushed harder, knowing the outpost was still a day's ride away. As dusk fell, fat snowflakes began drifting down, quickly accumulating on his coat and hat. "Come on, boy," he urged his horse forward. "Just a few more miles to that ridge. We'll shelter there." By morning, 6 inches of fresh snow blanketed the ground. Vaughn broke camp early, concern growing as the snow continued. By midday, visibility had dropped to mere yards, and he navigated mostly by instinct and his knowledge of the land. When he finally spotted the outpost through the swirling white, relief washed over him. It was little more than a sturdy cabin with a small stable, flying the territorial flag from a pole out front. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. At least someone was there. Vaughn approached cautiously, calling out as he neared. When no response came, he drew his pistol and dismounted. The door of the cabin hung partially open. "Hello, the house," he called again. Silence. He pushed the door open with his boot, gun raised. The cabin was empty but for sparse furnishings. A table, 2 chairs, a small stove still emanating warmth, and a narrow bed against the far wall. On the table sat an open ledger and what appeared to be a woman's glove. Vaughn frowned, holstering his pistol. He examined the ledger, finding the last entry dated just yesterday, December 15, 1882. Territorial Agent J. Whitmore departed for Cheyenne, Agent V. Jarrett to maintain outpost until relief arrives after Christmas. His eyes narrowed. V. Jarrett. The contract had mentioned of V. Jarrett, but Vaughn had assumed it was a man. No territorial governor in his right mind would station a woman alone at a remote outpost, especially not before winter. Vaughn continued searching the cabin, finding more evidence of a female presence: a hairbrush with long strands of honey-colored hair, a trunk containing women's clothing, and a small Bible with the inscription, "To Victoria with love, Father." Victoria Jarrett. A woman alone at this godforsaken outpost. Outside, the howling wind intensified. Vaughn stepped onto the porch, scanning the surroundings. The stable was empty except for a few bales of hay. No horses, no sign of anyone. Then he saw it, a piece of paper nailed to the doorframe, half covered with snow. He tore it free, brushing away ice crystals to read the hastily scrawled message, "Gone to check fence line, back by sunset." VJ. Vaughn crumpled the note in his fist, surveying the white landscape. The sun was already low on the horizon, and the blizzard showed no sign of relenting. If Victoria Jarrett had gone out in this, she might already be dead. The sensible thing would be to wait out the storm. He had supplies, shelter, and no obligation to risk his life for a foolish woman who didn't know better than to venture out in a Wyoming blizzard. "Damn it all," he muttered, turning back to his horses. 20 minutes later, Vaughn rode out into the storm, following what he hoped were tracks leading west from the outpost. The rational part of him screamed that this was madness, that he was risking his life for a stranger. But something deeper drove him forward, perhaps the memory of his mother's face the last time he saw her alive, or simply the code that had been beaten into him since childhood. In the wilderness, you don't leave people behind. The light faded quickly, and soon Vaughn was navigating by instinct alone. The cold bit through his layers, and ice formed on his mustache and the brim of his hat. He called out periodically, his voice swallowed by the wind. After nearly an hour, his horse balked, refusing to go farther in the near darkness and driving snow. Vaughn dismounted, leading the animal by the reins, squinting against the elements. That's when he heard it, a faint cry carried on the wind. He paused, tilting his head to listen. "Hello," he shouted, "anyone out there?" Another cry, slightly clearer. Vaughn tied his horse to a stunted pine and forged ahead on foot, following the sound. 20 yards later, he found her. She sat huddled against a rock outcropping, half buried in snow, clutching what appeared to be a rifle. Her hat was gone, and her honey-blonde hair whipped around her face in the wind. Even in the dim light, Vaughn could see her lips had turned blue. "Miss Jarrett?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, striking blue even in her distress. "Who?" she managed through chattering teeth. "Vaughn Forrester." "From the Double Fork, I've come with supplies." He quickly assessed her condition, no visible injuries, but the cold had clearly taken its toll. "Can you stand?" She nodded weakly. Vaughn helped her to her feet, noting with surprise that she stood nearly to his shoulder, taller than he expected. She swayed dangerously, and he caught her around the waist. "My horse," she said, her voice barely audible. "What happened?" "Spooked by something, threw me, ran off." Each word seemed an effort. Vaughn cursed under his breath. "We need to get you back now." He half carried her to his horse, then lifted her into the saddle. She clutched the pommel weakly as he mounted behind her, wrapping one arm securely around her waist. Her body felt like ice against him. "Stay awake, Miss Jarrett," he commanded as he urged the horse forward. "Talk to me." "Victoria," she murmured. "Everyone calls me Victoria." "Fine, Victoria, tell me what the hell you're doing out here alone." Even in her state, she managed a sound of indignation. "My job. Territorial agent." Vaughn snorted. The Territory sent a woman to manage an outpost alone before winter. "I volunteered," she said, her voice slightly stronger. "No one else would take this assignment." "I can't imagine why," he replied dryly. The journey back seemed interminable. Victoria drifted in and out of awareness, and Vaughn found himself talking continuously to keep her conscious, telling her about the Double Fork, about the cattle, about anything that came to mind. When they finally reached the cabin, Victoria was barely conscious. Vaughn carried her inside, laying her gently on the bed. Working quickly, he built up the fire in the stove, then returned to her side. "Miss Jarrett," Victoria. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes." Her eyes opened slightly. "I can manage," she whispered. "You can't even sit up." He began removing her boots. "I promise to be a gentleman." With as much propriety as the situation allowed, Vaughn helped her out of her frozen outer garments, wrapping her in blankets he warmed by the stove. Once she was settled, he prepared a hot drink from his supplies. "Drink," he commanded, lifting her head slightly. Victoria sipped obediently, color gradually returning to her face. For the first time, Vaughn got a proper look at her. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with delicate features that seemed at odds with her chosen profession. Her honey-blonde hair, now drying in the cabin's warmth, fell in loose waves past her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger. "You saved my life." Vaughn merely nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "What were you doing out there anyway?" "Checking the fence line for breaks. This outpost marks the boundary of the new reservation agreement. I'm supposed to report any violations." Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "And they sent you alone." Victoria's chin lifted slightly. I'm perfectly capable. I grew up on a ranch in Colorado. I can ride, shoot, and track as well as any man. Except the part where I found you freezing to death. Her cheeks flushed. The blizzard came on faster than I expected. I misjudged. Out here, misjudgments kill. She looked away. I know, my father died last year when our ranch was raided. He misjudged the threat. Vaughn's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry. Victoria met his gaze again, a surprising steel in her blue eyes. Don't be, I'm not here for sympathy. After father died, I needed work. The territorial government was hiring agents who knew ranching. I qualified. And no one objected to sending a woman. A small smile curved her lips. They didn't know I was a woman until I arrived in Cheyenne. By then, they were desperate to fill the position. Despite himself, Vaughn felt a reluctant admiration. Still, he knew the dangers of the frontier better than most. It's no place for a woman alone. Victoria's smile faded. Is it a place for anyone alone, Mr. Forrester? The question caught him off guard. Before he could respond, she continued. What about you? Do you have family at the Double Fork? No, he replied shortly. Just my ranch hands. No wife, children. Vaughn stood abruptly. You should rest. I'll see to the horses and bring in the supplies. Outside, the storm continued unabated. Vaughn tended to the animals, brought in his supplies, and cleared snow from around the cabin doors. All the while, Victoria's question echoed in his mind. Is it a place for anyone alone? He had always believed it was. The frontier demanded self-reliance. Attachments were weaknesses that the territory exploited. Yet something about finding Victoria in that snowdrift had shaken him, not just the near tragedy of it, but the realization that she had been out there alone, with no one to miss her if she disappeared. Just like him, when he returned to the cabin, Victoria was sitting up in bed, color restored to her cheeks. She had combed her hair and wore a woolen shawl over her shoulders. The storm's getting worse, Vaughn said, stamping snow from his boots. We're stuck here for at least a day, maybe more. Victoria nodded. There's food in the pantry, not much but enough. Vaughn added wood to the stove, then unpacked some of his own provisions. I brought beef and coffee, real coffee, not that chicory nonsense they send to outposts. For the first time, Victoria smiled genuinely. Real coffee sounds wonderful. They prepared a simple meal together, Victoria insisting on helping despite Vaughn's objections. As they ate, she explained her duties at the outpost, maintaining records of travelers, monitoring the reservation boundary, and relaying messages between Cheyenne and the more remote settlements. How long are you stationed here? Vaughn asked. Until spring, at least. Agent Whitmore was supposed to stay through Christmas, but he received news that his wife was ill. She looked down at her plate. He left yesterday morning, just before the storm hit. The relief agent won't arrive until after the new year. Vaughn frowned. You mean to say you'll be here alone on Christmas? Victoria shrugged. It's just another day out here. The casual dismissal bothered him more than it should have. Christmas at the Double Fork wasn't elaborate, but Lyle always managed to prepare a special meal, and the men exchanged small gifts, practical items mostly, new gloves or knives. What about your family? Won't they expect you home? My mother died when I was a child. After father passed, there was just me, she smiled sadly. The ranch was sold to pay his debts. There's no home to return to. Vaughn recognized the loss in her eyes, the same he'd seen in his own reflection after burying his parents. But where he had withdrawn, building walls between himself and the world, Victoria had ventured out into it. You're very brave, he said suddenly. Victoria looked up, surprised. Or very foolish, depending on who you ask. Maybe both. He poured more coffee for them both. Most men I know wouldn't take this assignment. Is that a compliment, Mr. Forrester? Vaughn, he corrected. And yes, I suppose it is. They talked late into the evening. Victoria told him about growing up on the Colorado ranch, learning to break horses alongside her father, and her dreams of someday having a place of her own again. Vaughn found himself sharing stories of the Double Fork, the challenges of the past seasons, and even memories of his parents that he'd kept locked away for years. When Victoria finally returned to bed, Vaughn made a pallet for himself near the stove. As he lay listening to the storm outside, he realized he'd spoken more in one evening than he had in months at the ranch. Something about Victoria drew words from him, her directness perhaps, or the way she listened as though every word mattered. It was disconcerting and dangerous. Attachment was weakness on the frontier. morning brought no relief from the storm. The snow had drifted against the cabin, nearly covering the lower windows. Vaughn dug out the door and checked on the horses, finding them restless but safe in the small stable. When he returned, Victoria had prepared breakfast and laid out a map of the area. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble. "Your ranch is here, correct?" She pointed to a location east of the outpost. Vaughn nodded, accepting the coffee she offered. "And you're contracted to supply this outpost through winter?" "Yes, monthly deliveries." Victoria traced a route on the map. "There are 2 other outposts within a 3-day ride. If you're willing, I could write to the territorial office, recommending that the Double Fork supply them as well." Vaughn studied the map. The additional contracts would mean significant income, enough to expand his herd in spring, maybe even build the new barn he'd been planning. "Why would you do that?" Victoria looked up, those striking blue eyes meeting his directly. "Because you saved my life, and because from what you've told me, you run a good operation. The outposts need reliable suppliers." Vaughn considered her offer. "I'll think about it." They spent the day confined to the cabin by the continuing storm. Victoria showed Vaughn the outpost records, explaining the territory's new system of communication and security. He was impressed by her knowledge and organization, though he remained skeptical of the wisdom of stationing her alone. "What happens if raiders come, or if you're injured like yesterday?" Victoria pointed to a shelf where a shotgun rested alongside a rifle. "I'm well armed, and there's a series of signals I can use to alert the nearest settlement in an emergency." "Signals that won't work in a blizzard." She sighed. "No system is perfect, Vaughn, but it's better than leaving these areas completely unmonitored." By evening, a fragile camaraderie had formed between them. They prepared another meal together, and Victoria produced a deck of cards. "Do you play poker, Mr. Forrester?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "Better than most," he replied, accepting the challenge. To his surprise, Victoria proved a formidable opponent, winning 3 hands in succession before Vaughn began to suspect she'd played this game many times before. "Where does a respectable woman learn to play poker like that?" he asked after she claimed another pot of matchsticks. Victoria laughed, the sound warming the cabin more than the stove ever could. "My father believed in a practical education. He said poker teaches you to read people, manage resources, and take calculated risks, all essential frontier skills." "Your father sounds like an unusual man." "He was." Her smile faded slightly. "He always said the frontier wasn't just for men, that it needed women's strength too." Not many agreed with him. "Including me?" Vaughn asked. Victoria met his gaze steadily. "You tell me. You seemed quite certain yesterday that the frontier is no place for a woman alone." Vaughn considered her question seriously. "I've seen too many people, men and women, broken by this land. It's not about capability. It's about the toll it takes." "And you think it takes a greater toll on women?" "I think it takes a toll on everyone who faces it alone." The admission surprised him as much as her. Victoria's expression softened. "Then perhaps that's the real problem, not women on the frontier, but anyone facing it without support." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Victoria's observation lingered in Vaughn's mind. Had he been wrong all these years? Not about the danger of attachments, but about the greater danger of isolation. The storm finally broke on the 3rd day. Brilliant sunshine reflected blindingly off the snow-covered landscape as Vaughn stepped outside to assess the conditions. "We can travel tomorrow if the weather holds," he told Victoria when he returned. "The drifts will have settled enough by then." Victoria nodded, but her expression seemed oddly conflicted. "Of course, you need to return to your ranch." "And you'll be alone again," he said, the realization sitting uneasily in his chest. "I'm used to it," she attempted a smile. "Besides, Christmas is only a week away. I plan to make it festive, even if it's just me." Vaughn frowned. "You said Agent Whitmore left because his wife was ill. Where did he go?" "Cheyenne, I believe. Why?" "And the relief agent won't arrive until after New Year's." Victoria nodded, watching him curiously. Vaughn made a quick calculation. "I could be back by Christmas Eve." "What?" "If I leave tomorrow, I can reach the Double Fork in 2 days. I'll check on things, gather more supplies, and return here by Christmas Eve." Victoria stared at him. "Why would you do that?" The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? The sensible course would be to deliver his contracted supplies and return to his ranch until the next scheduled delivery. Yet the thought of Victoria alone at Christmas in this remote outpost troubled him deeply. No one should be alone at Christmas, he said finally, not even territorial agents who are perfectly capable. A slow smile spread across Victoria's face, transforming it entirely. Are you sure it's a long ride in winter conditions? I'm sure, Vaughn replied, surprising himself with his certainty. The next morning they prepared for departure. Victoria insisted on accompanying Vaughn back to the Double Fork. I need to file my report in person anyway, she explained, and I should check if there's any news about Agent Whitmore's wife. They set out at dawn, Victoria riding Vaughn's spare mount. The landscape glittered under the winter sun, harshly beautiful in its stillness. They traveled steadily, Victoria proving to be as skilled a rider as she'd claimed. By nightfall, they had covered good distance. Vaughn made camp in a sheltered grove of pines, building a fire and preparing a simple meal from their provisions. As they sat eating, Victoria suddenly laughed. What's so funny? Vaughn asked, just thinking what people would say if they could see us. A woman territorial agent and a confirmed bachelor rancher, sitting by a campfire in the middle of nowhere. Vaughn smiled despite himself. They'd say we're both fools. Probably, Victoria looked at him across the fire, her expression serious. Why did you really come looking for me in that storm, Vaughn? The truth. The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Vaughn stared into the flames, considering his answer. I've spent 5 years believing the only way to survive out here is to depend on no one and let no one depend on me, he said finally. When I found that note and realized you were out in the blizzard alone, he paused. I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't tried. Victoria nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think you're wrong about surviving alone, I mean. Maybe, Vaughn admitted. When my parents died, I decided attachments were too risky. That caring for people only led to pain when you inevitably lost them. And has it worked being alone? Vaughn met her gaze across the fire. Until I met you, I thought it had. The admission hung in the air between them, neither willing to break the moment. Finally, Victoria spoke softly. We should get some rest, long ride tomorrow. They reached the Double Fork late the following day. The ranch appeared exactly as Vaughn had left it, the main house standing solid against the backdrop of mountains, smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, cattle gathered in the winter pasture. Lyle emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard, his weathered face registering surprise at the sight of Victoria. Boss, didn't expect you back so soon. His eyes darted curiously between them. Lyle, this is Victoria Jarrett, territorial agent from the Western Outpost. Miss Jarrett, Lyle Peterson, my foreman. Victoria smiled warmly, extending her hand. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Peterson. Lyle shook her hand, his expression betraying his bewilderment at finding his taciturn employer in the company of a beautiful woman. Likewise, miss, come on in, Martha's just made coffee. Martha, Vaughn asked, confused. Lyle had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Tom's sister, arrived 2 days ago needing work, she's been cooking for us. Vaughn raised an eyebrow but said nothing as they dismounted and led their horses to the stable. Once inside, Victoria looked around with obvious appreciation. You've built something beautiful here, she said, taking in the well-maintained barn with its sturdy stalls and organized tack room. It's functional, Vaughn replied, though her praise pleased him more than he cared to admit. After settling the horses, they headed to the main house. Inside, they found a middle-aged woman bustling about the kitchen, the aroma of fresh bread filling the air. She looked up in surprise as they entered. Mr. Forrester, I'm Martha Wilson, Tom's sister. She wiped her hands on her apron, obviously flustered. I hope it's all right. Lyle said you needed a cook, and after my husband passed. Vaughn raised a hand to stop her nervous explanation. It's fine, Mrs. Wilson. I'm sure Lyle made the right decision. Relief washed over the woman's face. Thank you, sir, and who's this? She asked, turning to Victoria. Victoria Jarrett, territorial agent, Victoria replied with a warm smile. Your bread smells wonderful, Mrs. Wilson. Martha beamed, just coming out of the oven. You two sit down and I'll bring you some with fresh coffee. As they sat at the kitchen table, Vaughn felt strangely self-conscious. The house that had always seemed perfectly adequate now struck him as sparse and unwelcoming through Victoria's eyes. There were no decorations, no personal touches, just the bare necessities for survival. Martha served them bread and coffee, then tactfully withdrew to the bunkhouse, leaving them alone. Your ranch is impressive, Victoria said, breaking the silence. How many head of cattle do you run? 200 plus about 30 horses. Vaughn warmed to the subject, explaining his breeding program and plans for expansion. Victoria listened attentively, asking knowledgeable questions that reflected her ranching background. As they talked, Vaughn found himself imagining what it would be like to have conversations like this every evening, to share the day's challenges and triumphs with someone who understood. The thought was both appealing and terrifying. After dinner, Vaughn showed Victoria to the small guest room that had once belonged to his mother. It remained largely unchanged since her death, simple but comfortable, with a patchwork quilt on the bed and curtains at the window. "Thank you," Victoria said, standing in the doorway, "for everything." Vaughn nodded awkwardly. "Get some rest. I'll show you around the ranch tomorrow." In his own room across the hall, Vaughn lay awake for hours, his thoughts in turmoil. Victoria's presence in his house at his table had awakened feelings he'd long suppressed, not just desire, though she was undeniably beautiful, but a deeper longing for connection. Is it a place for anyone alone? Her question from days earlier haunted him still. The next morning, Vaughn rose early and found Victoria already in the kitchen, helping Martha prepare breakfast. The two women were chatting easily, and Victoria looked up with a smile when he entered. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you don't mind, I wanted to make myself useful." "Not at all." Vaughn poured himself coffee, struck by how naturally she seemed to fit into his home. After breakfast, he took Victoria on a tour of the ranch. She showed genuine interest in everything: the cattle operation, the horse breeding program, even the mundane details of winter hay storage. Her questions were insightful, her observations astute. "You could run a place like this again," Vaughn said as they stood on a ridge overlooking the winter pasture. "Your own ranch, I mean." Victoria's expression turned wistful. "Perhaps someday. Land isn't cheap, though, and the territorial position barely pays enough to save. There's land available adjoining the Double Fork, good grazing land." The words escaped before Vaughn could consider their implications. Victoria looked at him sharply. "Are you suggesting I buy land next to yours?" Vaughn felt heat rise to his face despite the cold. "Just an observation." They returned to the house in thoughtful silence. That evening, after dinner with the ranch hands, Victoria announced her intention to ride into town the next day. "I need to check if there's any news from Cheyenne about Agent Whitmore," she explained. "And I should send a report about the outpost conditions." "I'll ride with you," Vaughn offered. "I need supplies anyway." The town of Sweetwater was a small but growing settlement, 12 miles from the Double Fork. They arrived mid-morning, tying their horses outside the general store. "I'll meet you back here in an hour," Victoria suggested. "The telegraph office is my first stop." Vaughn nodded, watching as she walked confidently down the muddy street. Even in her practical riding clothes, she drew glances from the townspeople, not just because she was a woman alone, but because of the natural grace and purpose in her movements. In the general store, Vaughn selected supplies for both the ranch and their return journey to the outpost. As he waited for the shopkeeper to total his purchases, Sheriff Mills entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Forrester, didn't expect to see you in town before Christmas." The sheriff nodded a greeting. "Just restocking supplies. I'm heading back to the western outpost tomorrow." Mills raised an eyebrow. "With that pretty blonde agent, saw her heading to the telegraph office." "Miss Jarrett, yes, she's checking for news from Cheyenne." The sheriff leaned closer. "Well, there's news all right, but not the kind she'll want to hear. Whitmore never made it to Cheyenne. His horse was found wandering near the South Pass Road 3 days ago. No sign of the man himself." Vaughn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Accident." Mills shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe not. There've been rumors of a band of deserters turned outlaws operating in that area. They've hit a couple of stagecoaches, from what I hear. And no one thought to warn the outposts. Territory stretched thin, Forrester, you know that. Besides, they're just rumors so far." Vaughn paid for his supplies quickly, his mind racing. If Whitmore had met with foul play on the road to Cheyenne, the same danger could threaten the western outpost in Victoria once she returned there. He found her outside the telegraph office, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Agent Whitmore never arrived in Cheyenne." Victoria handed him a telegram. "They've organized a search party, but with the recent snowfall." Vaughn nodded grimly. "Sheriff Mills just told me his horse was found on the South Pass Road." Victoria's eyes widened. "Alone, without Whitmore?" "Yes, and there are rumors of outlaws in the area." Victoria absorbed this information. her expression shifting from concern to determination. I should return to the outpost immediately. If there's danger in the area, I need to be there to warn travelers. Victoria, think about this. If Whitmore was attacked, you could be next. That's precisely why I need to go back. It's my duty. Vaughn recognized the resolve in her voice, the same determination that had led her to take the assignment in the first place. Arguing would be futile. Then I'm coming with you, he said firmly. Victoria looked surprised. What about your ranch? Lyle can manage for a few more days. Vaughn met her gaze steadily. I'm not letting you face this alone. Something shifted in Victoria's expression, a softening around her eyes, a gentle curve to her lips. Thank you. They returned to the double fork to prepare for departure the next morning. Vaughn took Lyle aside and explained the situation, instructing him to manage the ranch until after Christmas. So you're riding back to that outpost with Miss Jarrett? Lyle asked, a knowing look in his weathered eyes. She shouldn't be alone if there are outlaws in the area, Vaughn replied defensively. Lyle merely nodded. Been working for you 5 years now, boss. First time I've seen you worry about anyone but the cattle. Vaughn had no response to that. That evening, Martha prepared a special dinner as a send-off. The mood was surprisingly festive, with the ranch hands sharing stories and even Victoria contributing tales of her adventures as a territorial agent. Vaughn found himself watching her, the animation in her face as she spoke, the way her hands moved expressively, the sound of her laughter. After dinner, Victoria helped Martha clear the table while the men moved to the porch for pipes and conversation. When Vaughn returned inside an hour later, he found Victoria alone in the sitting room, examining a photograph on the mantel. Your parents? She asked as he entered. Vaughn nodded, moving to stand beside her. The photograph showed a stern-faced couple in their Sunday best, his father's hand resting protectively on his mother's shoulder. They came here from Missouri in '65. Started the ranch with nothing but 20 head of cattle and a dream. Victoria studied the image. They looked strong, determined. They were, Vaughn's voice softened with memory. Father was tough, expected everything to be done right the first time. But he was fair, and Mother, he smiled slightly. She could outdraw most men and still have dinner on the table by 6. You miss them. It wasn't a question, but Vaughn answered anyway. Every day. Victoria placed the photograph carefully back on the mantel. When my father died, I thought the pain would kill me too. For months, I could barely function. She turned to face him. But eventually, I realized that isolating myself only made the grief worse. It was by connecting with others, taking this position, meeting people along my routes that I began to heal. Vaughn considered her words. Had he made the same mistake, pushing everyone away after his parents' deaths, believing solitude was safer than risking further loss? It's not easy, he admitted, letting people in. No, Victoria agreed softly. But maybe it's necessary. Their eyes met and Vaughn felt something shift between them, a recognition, an understanding that transcended words. For a moment he thought he might close the distance between them, might find out if her lips were as soft as they looked. Instead he stepped back. We should both get some rest, long ride tomorrow. Victoria nodded, a flicker of something, disappointment, crossing her face. Good night, Vaughn. Good night, Victoria. They set out at dawn the next day, their horses laden with supplies for the outpost. The weather was clear but cold, the landscape transformed into a glittering white expanse under the winter sun. They rode mostly in comfortable silence, each lost in thought. By mid-afternoon, they had covered significant ground when Victoria suddenly reined in her horse, pointing to the horizon. Smoke, she said, too much for a campfire. Vaughn followed her gaze, spotting the dark column rising against the pale sky. Could be a settler's cabin. There are no registered homesteads in this area. Victoria's expression was grim. It's too close to the outpost for comfort. They approached cautiously, leaving the trail to circle through a stand of pines. As they crested a small rise, the source of the smoke became clear. A wagon burned nearly to its frame, wisps of black smoke still rising from the charred remains. Vaughn dismounted, motioning for Victoria to stay back as he examined the scene. The snow around the wagon was trampled by multiple horses, and scattered nearby were the contents of trunks and crates, clothes, books, household items discarded as worthless to the attackers. Looks like they were after valuables, he said, returning to Victoria. No bodies, at least. Thank God for that, she murmured, but this confirms the rumors. There are outlaws operating in the area. Vaughn nodded grimly. And there between us and the outpost. They decided to continue, but with extreme caution, staying off the main trail and keeping to sheltered routes where possible. As dusk approached, Vaughn selected a campsite in a rocky outcropping that offered protection from both the elements and potential observers. "We'll reach the outpost by noon tomorrow if we start early," he said as they prepared a cold dinner, unwilling to risk a fire that might attract attention. Victoria nodded, her expression somber. "I keep thinking about Agent Whitmore. If he encountered these outlaws." "Try not to dwell on it," Vaughn advised. "We don't know what happened yet." They ate in silence, the weight of potential danger settling over them. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Vaughn insisted on taking the first watch. "Wake me in 4 hours," Victoria said, wrapping herself in blankets near the sheltered side of the rocks. Vaughn nodded, positioning himself where he could observe the surrounding terrain while remaining hidden. The night passed slowly. During his watch, Vaughn found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Victoria. In just a few days, she had upended his carefully constructed worldview. Her courage, her determination, her willingness to face the frontier on its own terms while still maintaining her humanity, all challenged his belief that emotional isolation was the only way to survive. When it came time to wake her for her watch, Vaughn found himself reluctant to disturb her peaceful sleep. In repose, her face appeared younger, the strength and determination temporarily softened by vulnerability. He allowed her an extra half-hour before gently touching her shoulder. "Victoria," he whispered, "your watch." She woke instantly, alert despite the hour. "Anything." "All quiet," he assured her. "But stay vigilant." As Vaughn settled into his blankets, Victoria took up position on the rocks, rifle across her lap. The last thing he saw before closing his eyes was her silhouette against the star-filled sky, steadfast and unafraid. Morning brought renewed caution as they continued toward the outpost. They traveled silently, alert for any sign of danger. Around mid-morning, Victoria suddenly raised her hand, signaling Vaughn to stop. "Listen," she whispered. Faintly carried on the winter air came the sound of voices and horses, multiple horses, approaching from the direction of the outpost. They quickly led their mounts into a dense stand of pines, concealing themselves as the sounds grew louder. Soon a group of riders came into view on the trail below, 5 men heavily armed, their horses laden with what appeared to be stolen goods. "Those saddlebags are territorial issue," Victoria whispered, pointing to one of the riders. "Standard equipment for outpost agents." Vaughn's grip tightened on his rifle. "The outpost." Victoria's face paled. "They must have hid it after Whitmore left. That's why he never made it to Cheyenne. He encountered them on the road." The outlaws passed within 50 yards of their hiding place, close enough that Vaughn could see their faces. Rough, unshaven men with the hard eyes of those who killed without remorse. One wore what was unmistakably a territorial agent's coat. After the riders passed, Vaughn and Victoria remained hidden for several more minutes, ensuring they were truly gone. "We need to reach the outpost," Victoria said urgently. "There might be other travelers seeking shelter there, not knowing it's been compromised." They rode hard, abandoning caution for speed. As they approached the outpost, Vaughn noticed Victoria's posture stiffen, her hand moving to the pistol at her hip. The outpost appeared intact from a distance, the territorial flag still flying. But as they drew closer, signs of trouble became evident. The door hung partially open, and no smoke rose from the chimney despite the cold. Vaughn motioned for Victoria to stay back as he approached cautiously, rifle ready. He dismounted at a distance, tying his horse to a tree before advancing on foot. Victoria, ignoring his gesture, dismounted as well, drawing her pistol as she moved to cover his flank. The interior of the cabin had been ransacked, furniture overturned, supplies scattered, records torn from their ledgers. But what drew their immediate attention was the body slumped in the corner, a man in territorial uniform, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Victoria rushed forward, kneeling beside him. "Agent Whitmore," she confirmed grimly, checking for a pulse she clearly didn't expect to find. "He's been dead at least 3 days." Vaughn surveyed the damage. "They took anything valuable." "Weapons, supplies, horses." "But why bring his body back here? He was supposedly on the road to Cheyenne." Vaughn examined the scene more carefully. "I don't think they killed him on the road. Look, no blood trail, and he's been positioned here deliberately." He pointed to marks on the floor. "They ambushed him here at the outpost, then took his horse and rode toward Cheyenne, probably to throw off any search." Victoria's face hardened. "They knew about the outposts, knew when agents would be traveling." She stood slowly. This wasn't random, they've been targeting the territorial network specifically. Vaughn nodded grimly, which means they might come back, expecting the relief agent after Christmas. They worked quickly to secure the outpost, barricading the broken door and windows, gathering what weapons and ammunition remained. Victoria insisted on giving Agent Whitmore a proper burial, and Vaughn helped her dig a grave in the frozen ground behind the cabin. As they stood beside the fresh mound, Victoria spoke softly. He was a good man. Had 3 children waiting for him in Cheyenne. Vaughn placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling her tremble slightly beneath his touch. I'm sorry. If I had been here, she began. Then you might be lying beside him, Vaughn said firmly. You can't blame yourself for this. Victoria turned to face him, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't. I blame the men who did it, and I intend to see them brought to justice. How? There are at least 5 of them, and they're heavily armed. The nearest military outpost is 2 days' ride north. I can get there, bring back soldiers. No, Vaughn's voice was sharper than intended. It's too dangerous. These men aren't just thieves, they're killers who specifically targeted a territorial agent. Then what do you suggest? Wait here for them to return. Vaughn considered their options. We fortify this place, set up defenses. When they return expecting an easy target, they'll find something very different. Victoria studied his face, weighing his words. You're suggesting we ambush them, the 2 of us against at least 5 armed men. With the advantage of preparation and surprise, yes. A slow smile spread across Victoria's face, not of humor but of grim determination. Agent Whitmore deserves justice. And those men need to be stopped before they hit another outpost. They spent the remainder of the day preparing. Vaughn constructed defensive positions inside the cabin, while Victoria inventoried the remaining supplies and weapons. By nightfall, they had transformed the small outpost into a fortress of sorts, with multiple firing positions, barricaded entrances, and escape routes planned. As they ate a simple dinner by lamplight, Victoria studied a map of the territory. Based on their movement pattern, I think they'll return within the next 3 days. They've been hitting outposts systematically, moving west to east. Vaughn nodded. That gives us time to prepare more thoroughly. He hesitated, then added, Victoria, if things go badly. They won't, she interrupted firmly. But if they do, I want you to know something. She met his gaze steadily. I don't regret taking this assignment despite everything. If I hadn't, I would never have met you. The simple honesty of her words caught Vaughn off guard. Before he could respond, Victoria continued. You asked why I really volunteered for this post. The truth is, after my father died, I felt lost, rudderless. Taking this assignment was my way of proving I could stand on my own, that I wasn't defined by loss. Vaughn recognized the feeling all too well. And have you proven it? Victoria smiled slightly. I thought I had, but then you found me in that snowstorm and I realized something important. Strength isn't about facing things alone. It's about having the courage to accept help when you need it. I'm still learning that lesson myself, Vaughn admitted. Victoria reached across the table, her hand covering his. Perhaps we can learn it together. The touch of her hand sent warmth spreading through Vaughn's chest. For 5 years he had maintained careful distance from anyone who might breach his defenses. Yet in less than a week this remarkable woman had done exactly that. I'd like that, he said softly. They spent the evening making final preparations, checking and rechecking their defenses. When it came time to sleep, they agreed to take watches, with Vaughn taking the first shift. As he sat by the window, rifle across his lap, Vaughn found his gaze repeatedly drawn to Victoria's sleeping form. The realization struck him with unexpected force. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Not to outlaws, not to the frontier, not to the distance between his ranch and her duties. The admission changed everything. For years, he had convinced himself that attachments were weaknesses on the frontier. Now he understood they could also be strength, the strength to fight harder, to endure more, to find reasons for survival beyond mere existence. When morning came, they continued their preparations. Victoria suggested creating false trails to confuse any approaching outlaws, while Vaughn rigged early warning systems around the perimeter. Working together, they established a defensive strategy that maximized their advantages. Christmas Eve is tomorrow, Victoria noted as they ate lunch. Not exactly how I plan to spend it. Vaughn managed a smile. Defending an outpost against outlaws isn't traditional, I'll grant you. What would you be doing at the Double Fork? She asked. Nothing special, the men exchanged small gifts. Martha would probably cook something nice. He paused, remembering. My mother used to make gingerbread, the smell would fill the whole house. Victoria's expression softened. My father would read a Christmas carol aloud by the fire. It took all evening, but I never minded. He did all the voices. The shared memories created a moment of normalcy amid their tense preparations, a reminder of what they were fighting for beyond mere survival. That night during Victoria's watch, Vaughn was awakened by her hand on his shoulder. Riders, she whispered, coming from the east. He rose quickly, joining her at the window. In the moonlight, he could make out 3 horsemen approaching slowly, their attention fixed on the cabin. Only 3, he murmured. Where are the others? Possibly circling around, Victoria replied. This feels wrong. They're being too obvious. Vaughn agreed. The approach lacked the caution he would expect from experienced outlaws. Stay here, cover me. Before Victoria could protest, he slipped out the back door, moving silently through the shadows to a position behind the stable. From there he had a clear view of the cabin's blind spots, and sure enough, 2 more riders were approaching stealthily from the west, using the terrain for cover. Vaughn worked his way back to the cabin, entering through their prearranged signal, 3 soft taps followed by 2 louder ones. Victoria met him at the door, rifle ready. 2 more coming from behind, he confirmed. They're trying to flank us. Victoria nodded. We stick to the plan. Let them think they have surprise on their side. They took their positions, Victoria at the front window, partially visible to draw attention, while Vaughn concealed himself near the rear door. The trap was set. The outlaws approached with increasing confidence, clearly believing the outpost was occupied by a single, unsuspecting agent. As the 3 in front dismounted, moving toward the cabin with weapons drawn, Victoria called out. Territorial Agent Jarrett, identify yourselves. The outlaws hesitated, exchanging glances. Then the leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. Just travelers seeking shelter, ma'am, he called, his voice falsely cordial. Our horses are tired from the trail. The outpost is closed, Victoria replied firmly. There's another shelter 10 miles east. The man's friendly demeanor vanished. I don't think you understand, lady, we're coming in. He nodded to his companions, who spread out, moving toward the cabin from different angles. Victoria fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt at the leader's feet. Next one won't miss, she promised. The outlaws responded with gunfire, shattering windows and splintering wood as Victoria ducked for cover. Simultaneously, the 2 men at the rear attempted to force the back door, exactly as Vaughn had anticipated. He waited until they were committed to the entry, then fired twice in rapid succession. 1 man fell immediately, the other staggered back, wounded but still dangerous. Vaughn fired again, and the second man collapsed. At the front, Victoria engaged the remaining 3 outlaws with precision fire that kept them pinned behind their horses. One tried to circle around, only to trigger one of their warning systems, a series of cans that clattered loudly, giving away his position. Victoria's shot found him a moment later. The leader, recognizing the trap, shouted to his remaining companion, "Fall back, it's an ambush." As they retreated toward their horses, Vaughn moved to the front window, adding his fire to Victoria's. The outlaws mounted hastily, one taking a bullet in the shoulder before they galloped away, disappearing into the darkness. Silence fell over the outpost, broken only by the ringing in their ears from the gunfire. Vaughn moved cautiously to check the men at the rear of the cabin, both dead. Victoria confirmed the 3rd casualty at the front. The leader got away, she said grimly, along with 1 other. But they won't be back, Vaughn replied. Not to this outpost. Victoria nodded, though her expression remained troubled. They'll find other targets, other victims. We'll alert the territorial authorities. With 3 of the gang dead and evidence of their crimes, they'll hunt down the others. They secured the bodies, then checked each other for injuries. Apart from minor cuts from flying glass and wood splinters, both had emerged unscathed. The adrenaline of combat slowly faded, leaving them exhausted but relieved. We should try to get some rest, Vaughn suggested. Take turns keeping watch in case they decide to return. Victoria nodded, suddenly looking very young and vulnerable despite her courage during the firefight. Without thinking, Vaughn pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She stiffened momentarily in surprise, then relaxed into his embrace, her arms encircling his waist. I thought I might lose you, he murmured into her hair. Victoria looked up, her blue eyes meeting his. You didn't. We're both still here. The realization that they had faced death together and survived created a bond stronger than words could express. Vaughn's hand moved to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. Victoria's lips parted slightly, her gaze never leaving his. When he finally kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. Her lips were soft beneath his, yielding yet responding with equal passion. All the barriers he'd constructed over years of solitude crumbled in that moment, swept away by the simple truth that had been staring him in the face since he found her in the snowstorm. He loved her. They broke apart slowly, both breathless. Victoria's face was flushed, her eyes bright with emotion. "I've wanted to do that since the first night at your ranch," she admitted softly. Vaughn smiled, resting his forehead against hers. "I've been fighting it since I found you in the snow. And now I'm done fighting," he said simply. They took turns keeping watch through the remainder of the night, though neither slept much. Dawn broke clear and cold Christmas Eve morning, with an unseasonal peace settling over the outpost after the violence of the night. As they prepared a simple breakfast, Victoria glanced out the window at the 3 fresh graves behind the cabin, Agent Whitmore and the 2 outlaws they had buried before sunrise. "Not the Christmas I expected," she said quietly. Vaughn moved to stand beside her. "We could still return to the Double Fork, it's not too late." Victoria considered the offer, then shook her head. "My duty is here, at least until the relief agent arrives." She turned to face him, her expression resolute. "But after that, I've been thinking about what comes next." "And what have you decided?" "That perhaps it's time to build something of my own again." She met his gaze steadily. "You mentioned land adjoining the Double Fork." Vaughn's heart raced at the implication. "It's good land, needs work, but the water rights are solid. I've saved most of my territorial pay. It might be enough for a down payment, if the owner is willing to negotiate terms." "I happen to know the owner," Vaughn said, unable to suppress a smile. "I think he'd be very motivated to make a favorable arrangement." Victoria laughed, the sound bright and hopeful in the cabin that had witnessed so much darkness. "Mr. Forrester, are you suggesting I become your neighbor?" "Actually, Miss Jarrett," he replied, taking her hands in his, "I was thinking of something more permanent than neighbors." Victoria's eyes widened. "Vaughn, I know it's sudden. I know we've only known each other a short time." He tightened his grip on her hands. "But I also know that in 1 week, you've changed everything I believed about surviving on the frontier. About what makes life worth living." "And what did you discover?" she asked softly. "That the frontier isn't about enduring alone, it's about building something together." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Victoria. When this is over, when your replacement arrives, will you come back to the Double Fork, not as my neighbor but as my wife?" Tears welled in Victoria's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Vaughn kissed her again, pouring all his newfound hope into the embrace. When they separated, Victoria laughed softly. "What?" he asked. "Just thinking about what Agent Collins will say when he arrives after New Year's, to find I've not only captured outlaws, but acquired a fiancée as well." Vaughn grinned. "He'll probably request a transfer to a less exciting outpost." They spent Christmas Eve repairing the cabin as best they could, securing it against both weather and potential threats. By evening, the outpost was relatively comfortable once more, the broken windows covered with spare boards, the bullet holes patched. As darkness fell, Vaughn surprised Victoria by producing a small package from his saddlebag. "I was going to wait until tomorrow," he said, presenting it to her, "but it seems right to do this on Christmas Eve." Victoria accepted the package with surprise. "I don't have anything for you." "You've given me more than enough already," Vaughn assured her. She unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, lay a simple gold band set with a single modest diamond. "It was my mother's," Vaughn explained. "Father gave it to her their first Christmas on the frontier. Said it was to remind her that even in the harshest wilderness, beautiful things could flourish." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she looked from the ring to Vaughn. "It's perfect." He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit as though made for her. "Merry Christmas, Victoria," he said softly. She kissed him in response, a promise of all the Christmases to come. They spent the remaining days until the new year alternating between vigilance and planning for their future. Victoria began drafting her resignation from the territorial service, while Vaughn sketched expansions to the Double Fork Ranch house that would make it more suitable for a family. When Agent Collins finally arrived on January 2nd, he was greeted by not one but two armed individuals who required him to identify himself thoroughly before allowing him approach. "Quite a welcome," he commented dryly as they finally lowered their weapons. "I see the rumors of trouble weren't exaggerated." Victoria introduced herself and Vaughn, then briefed Collins on everything that had transpired: Whitmore's murder, the outlaw gang, and their defense of the outpost. Collins listened with increasing respect. "The territorial office received word about the outlaws 2 days ago," he confirmed. "Army patrols captured the remaining two near South Pass. They've confessed to attacking multiple outposts." "And Agent Whitmore's family?" Victoria asked. "They've been notified. His wife is recovering from influenza." Collins glanced at the fresh graves behind the cabin. "You've done good work here, Agent Jarrett. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." Victoria smiled, her hand finding Vaughn's. "Actually, I'll be submitting my resignation. I have other plans for the future." Collins noticed the ring on her finger and the connection between them. His expression shifted from surprise to understanding. "I see. Well, I can't say I blame you." "This is no place for—" "Be careful how you finish that sentence, Agent Collins," Vaughn interrupted, his tone light but his meaning clear. "Miss Jarrett has proven herself more capable than most men I know." Collins had the grace to look embarrassed. "Of course, I only meant that outpost duty is thankless work for anyone." They departed the following morning, leaving Collins to settle into his new post. As they rode away from the outpost that had brought them together, Victoria glanced back one last time. "I don't regret any of it," she said. "Not the danger, not the isolation. It led me to you." Vaughn reached across to take her hand. "The frontier brings hardship, that's certain, but it also brings unexpected gifts to those willing to see them." They rode on together toward the double fork, toward home, toward a future they would build together. The Wyoming landscape stretched vast and challenging before them, but for the first time, Vaughn saw not just its dangers but its possibilities. With Victoria beside him, the frontier wasn't a place to merely survive, it was a place to truly live. Spring arrived early that year. The Double Fork Ranch house, expanded and brightened under Martha's enthusiastic direction, welcomed guests from miles around for a wedding celebration unlike any the territory had seen. Victoria, radiant in a gown of ivory silk, exchanged vows with Vaughn beneath an arch of early wildflowers. As they began their life together, the legend spread throughout the territory of the cowboy who rode days through a blizzard to find a woman left alone at a remote outpost, and how together they had found not just survival, but love that would endure all seasons on the frontier.